Elon Musk would not have survived in the colonial era of America for a lot of things, but before we understand why he didn't stand a chance, welcome to Brutal History Sleeper. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. Kindly tell us what you do, where you are watching from, and the time there. We'd love to hear them. I drew inspiration from Sleepless Historian channel to do this, so I encourage you to also check out their channel. They are really impacting people and alleviating lives. I was overwhelmed by the soldiers, teachers, civil servants, and elderly people they are helping that I decided to help also. I only hope I can assist a little. We tell the kinds of stories that settle deep into your thoughts, long after the last word. This is not just history. This is sleep therapy, wrapped in blood-stained pages and foggy memories. Tonight, we wander back to the tar and feathering, one of the horrors of the colonial America. So lie back, breathe slow, and listen. If Elon Musk had been born in colonial America, he would have made it exactly 4 minutes into a town square protest before being pinned to a post, slathered in boiling tar, and feathered so hard you'd think the entire poultry population of New England had sacrificed itself just to shut him up. He would have tweeted something inflammatory about pine tar being the original blockchain, and 5 men in rough coats would have held him down without blinking. Because back then, nobody needed a trending hashtag to cancel you, they just needed a barrel of pain and a crowd hungry for spectacle. Tar and feathering wasn't reserved for the worst of the worst. It wasn't even a punishment handed out by courts. It was raw, democratic rage, doled out by the people, for the people, with a thick brush and no mercy. And it didn't start in America. It goes back to the 1100s, when Richard the Lionheart thought it would be hilarious to punish ship thieves by coating them in pitch and dumping feathers on top like some deranged medieval chef making human stew. But colonial America took that idea and said, let's make it personal. Because this wasn't just about punishing. It was about erasing. Dignity. Identity. Resistance. All scrubbed off the bone with a bucket of tar. Picture it now, a small New England town in winter. The streets are cold. The breath fogs. The trees are bare. But down near the center, the fire's already roaring. The townspeople are gathering. They bring torches, ropes, and just enough self-righteousness to make a horror show feel like a sermon. A man, maybe a tax collector, maybe a pacifist, maybe just someone with the wrong accent, has been accused. No trial. No defense. Just a charge and a nod. He's dragged from his home or his shop, bound at the wrists, and pulled into the center of the crowd. The tar's already heating in an iron cauldron. It bubbles thick and black, giving off a sweet, sickening smell of burnt pine and death. It sticks to the air. It sticks to your teeth. And when they pour it, ladle by ladle, onto bare flesh, it doesn't just burn. It invades. The skin bubbles. The nerves scream. Hair is gone instantly. The tar finds every fold, every wound, every breath. And the man doesn't stop screaming. Not at first. But the crowd doesn't flinch. Some of them laugh. Some of them chant. Children sit on barrels and point. The next step is feathers. Feathers are soft when they're in a pillow, but when you're sticky and bleeding and shivering from shock, they become weapons of shame. They stick to the tar like curses. They make the victim look like a joke, a freak, a cautionary tale. And when the man is covered head to toe in this grotesque costume of pain, they're not done. They parade him. They tie him to a cart or force him to walk, slowly, through the entire town. Every door. Every window. Every sneer. He doesn't cry for help anymore. He's not sure where his skin ends and the tar begins. He just walks. One foot in front of the other. And when it's over, if it ends, he collapses somewhere near the woods, or on the floor of a barn, or in a ditch. And if he lives, he will never forget the sound of the fire or the feel of the feathers. And if he dies, no one will write his name down. Because this was never about justice. It was about theater. Tar and feathering was performance art for the cruel. It made the crowd feel powerful, righteous, alive, and the victim feel like a story already fading. So the next time a billionaire says he's being publicly persecuted, offer him a pot of boiling pitch and a chicken. See if he still wants attention. If Logan Paul ever found himself covered in boiling tar, he'd probably ask someone to pass him a waterproof GoPro so he could capture his hero's journey in 4K, throw on a thumbnail with a big red arrow, and title the video, "I got tarred and feathered in Colonial America," and you won't believe what happened next. He'd be clickbait on fire, feathers flapping dramatically as he begged for likes in between muffled screams. And the worst part? The video would get 30 million views in under 24 hours. But this isn't entertainment. Not really. Back then, if someone was tarred and feathered, there was no comeback tour. No redemption arc. No brand deal waiting on the other side. There was only smoke, screams, and skin that peeled off like wet paper. Let's go back to that body we left in the ditch, the one barely breathing, coated in tar, with bits of white fluff clinging to blood like twisted snow. Let's walk through what it really felt like, what it smelled like, what it was. Tar, in the 18th century, wasn't some fancy chemical compound you bought in a labeled tub. It was thick pine pitch boiled down until it reached a bubbling inferno somewhere around 270 degrees Fahrenheit. That's twice the boiling point of water. And unlike water, it didn't run off the skin. It clung. It sank in. It wrapped around body hair like fingers. When poured directly onto bare skin, as it usually was, it seared through the outer layers in seconds, causing third-degree burns before the victim could even scream properly. And scream they did. Some tried to fight. Others went limp, their bodies shutting down before the pain could even register. And here's where it gets worse, because we haven't even added the feathers yet. But first, let's talk about how they applied the tar. It wasn't always poured. Sometimes, if the mob felt merciful, or lazy, they used brushes. Big, thick brushes made of horsehair or straw. They dipped them in boiling tar and painted the victim's body like they were crafting a grotesque masterpiece. The brush would scrape across the skin, ripping open blisters as it moved. Eyes were fair game. So were mouths. One unlucky man in Pennsylvania had tar forced between his lips and onto his tongue. He didn't speak again for the rest of his life. Then came the feathers. These weren't nice, clean feathers plucked for pillows. They were dirty, flea-bitten, bird-smelling cast-offs from whatever fowl had recently been killed for dinner. They were tossed onto the tar like confetti, and they stuck instantly. The combination was hideous. A man became a monster. Covered in black goo and white fluff, dripping, twitching, unrecognizable even to his own children. But still, the punishment wasn't finished. Because humiliation was never a solo act in colonial America. It needed an audience. So they paraded him through town squares, past markets, into the view of every man, woman, and child who wanted to feel just a little bit better about their own quiet sins. The victim became a walking warning. Don't speak up. Don't side with the British. Don't undercut prices. Don't gossip. Whatever offense the mob decided deserved punishment, tar and feathering made sure everyone remembered the price. Some were tied to carts. Others were forced to walk barefoot. The tar hardened fast in winter, turning every movement into agony. Cracking skin. Feathers tearing off with flesh. The smell was everywhere. Pine pitch, sweat, and cooked meat. No one would touch you. No one would help you. You were poison. You were spectacle. You were gone. And when the parade ended, they dumped you like trash. No doctor. No bandage. No water. Just a body, steaming in the cold, buzzing with flies in the summer, whispering prayers that no one would answer. Some tried to scrub it off. They used sand, knives, even fire. Most gave up. The tar never really left. It stayed under the nails, behind the ears, in the folds of skin. A constant reminder that the town you once lived in had turned into your executioner. And here's something no one talks about: what happened afterward. The victims didn't just suffer. They disappeared. Some moved away in shame, never to be heard from again. Others lingered, too broken to leave. A few, too proud to run, stayed, only to be tarred again. Because the mob doesn't forgive. The mob remembers. So the next time someone like Logan tries to turn pain into profit, imagine him walking barefoot across splinters, his skin blistering under homemade tar, feathers fluttering off like the last shreds of ego, and ask yourself if the comment section would still be laughing. If Taylor Swift lived in colonial America, she would have released Tarring Season as a surprise album, packed with sad little ballads about her neighbor being paraded down the street in a coat of burning tar and chicken fluff. She'd rhyme pitch with witch, write a metaphor about a feathered heart, and call it her most vulnerable work yet. She'd stand at her window with a quill and say, "It's just so heartbreaking." Then go back inside before the blood hit the snow. Because make no mistake, when a man was tarred and feathered, the parade afterward was never an afterthought. It was the point. The pain wasn't complete until it was performed. The victim we left last time, let's call him Thomas, since his name, like so many others, was lost to wind and silence, he isn't done suffering. His skin is already half-cooked. His clothes, if they weren't stripped, are fused to his body in places. Tar bubbles in the crook of his elbows. Feathers flap at his shoulders, his thighs, his face. The humiliation is worse than the pain now, and that's saying something, because the pain is endless. His lips are cracked. His knees are weak. But the mob isn't ready to let him crawl away just yet. They want to show their work, so they hoist him up. Sometimes onto a cart. Sometimes they tie his hands behind him and make him walk. If he can't walk, they drag him. The wheels rattle on cobblestones. The horses don't flinch. People line the narrow streets, children on fences, women at windows, shopkeepers stepping out just long enough to say, "See?" That's what happens. There's no shame in watching. Shame's for the man in tar. The crowd? The crowd is righteous, and here's the part that really breaks the bones beneath the skin: the victim's neighbors are watching too. His friends. His clients. The butcher who used to save him the good cuts. The midwife who once asked him for help lifting a barrel. His wife, maybe. His children, if he has any, clutching the edge of a doorframe, eyes wide with the kind of fear that won't leave even when they're old and gray and lying on a deathbed. He passes the baker's shop, the church, the tavern. Sometimes there's music. Fiddles. Drums. Laughter timed to the rhythm of his broken steps. The tar has started to harden now. Every movement rips a layer of skin. Feathers fall behind him like breadcrumbs. Blood mixes with snow or dust or rainwater. His head hangs low, but he doesn't close his eyes. He can't afford to. Not when every blink brings a fresh wave of dizziness. Not when a rock or a child's boot might hit his shins and topple him over. The crowd wants him upright. To fall is to disrespect the show. And let's not romanticize the crowd. These weren't all men with pitchforks and cloaks. This was everyone. The elderly. The teenagers. The bored. Some cheered. Some jeered. Some just stared. But none of them stopped it. That's the part they won't write sad songs about. The silence of the neighbor who looked away. The father who told his son, "Watch closely." The woman who whispered, "He deserved it," just loud enough to feel safe. And still he walks, his feet are blistered now. His arms tremble. The tar has begun to pull. Tar doesn't dry cleanly. It cracks. It splits. And with every movement, it digs into the wounds it helped create. His body is turning against him. The feathers itch. The blood crusts. The weight of the humiliation is heavier than the pain, somehow. He doesn't know what he did to deserve this. Maybe he signed the wrong paper. Maybe he said the wrong thing at the tavern. Maybe someone lied. It doesn't matter. The crowd's already made up its mind. In some towns, they ended the parade at the edge of the woods. Dumped the victim out of the cart, or shoved him into the trees with a slap and a curse and a warning, "Don't come back." Other towns preferred a more symbolic ending. Tied to a post, left in the town square until someone felt merciful enough to cut the ropes. Occasionally, someone died right there, in front of everyone, and they called it just part of the risk. But let's say Thomas survives. Let's say he stumbles away, half-conscious, feathers still clinging to his face. Let's say he finds a creek. He tries to wash off the tar, but it's too late. It's baked in. It won't leave. He scrubs with stones. He screams. The birds scatter. The blood runs. Days later, he's still picking feathers out of his skin. His fingers are swollen. His eyes are dull. He hasn't eaten. He doesn't know how to go home, or even if he can go home. Because once you've been tarred and feathered, you're marked. Not just physically. Socially. Spiritually. You're the man who was punished. And everyone remembers. So maybe Taylor does write a song about him. But it won't be played in the taverns. It won't be sung in the streets. It'll be whispered between floorboards, or hummed by someone too old to forget, too scared to speak. The chorus will be simple. 4 steps. A scream. A feather. A name. And it won't make the pain go away. If Mark Zuckerberg had been around in 1770, he wouldn't have stopped the tar and feathering, he would have optimized it, monetized it, and rolled it out in beta to all 13 colonies with a smug little tagline like, bringing communities together, one humiliation at a time. He'd be there in his crisp little waistcoat, adjusting his powdered wig, suggesting updates like feather placement algorithms and scream to satisfaction reaction analytics, all while assuring the local council that this was the future of accountability. Imagine it. The Colonial newsfeed glowing by lantern light, sketches uploaded of the latest victim with real-time doodles of agony, a thumbs-up button for good riddance, a laugh react for his screams sound like a goose, and a limited edition mob moments carousel featuring the town's favorite humiliations from the year. Engagement would skyrocket. And if the poor bastard being dragged through the square tried to speak out, Zuckerberg would quietly throttle his reach, hide his complaints behind community guidelines, and suggest he purchase the new reputation repair bundle for 9.99 shillings a month. Because in this timeline, public torture wouldn't just be justice, it'd be content. And the terrifying part is that no one would question it. Because they didn't question it then either. Tar and feathering wasn't some dark, underground punishment, it was communal entertainment with moral seasoning. It was the 18th century equivalent of trending drama, except instead of retweets and clapbacks, you had buckets of bubbling tar and sacks of grimy feathers ripped from geese that hadn't even cooled. Townspeople didn't just tolerate the spectacle, they anticipated it. These were people who lived slow, repetitive lives filled with the same 4 smells, the same 7 neighbors, and the same nagging suspicion that someone, somewhere, was getting away with something. So when a name was called and a body was dragged into the square, it wasn't horror, it was relief. It was a chance to look down without risking anything. The baker came. The blacksmith came. Mothers brought toddlers, and old women packed stools. They'd crowd around the square with bread in their hands and gossip on their tongues, excited to watch the ritual of pain unfold. The tar was already simmering in a pot that reeked of pine, ash, and something sour, like betrayal curdled in heat. No one asked where the tar came from. No one asked who paid for the feathers. It just appeared, like rage always does when you feed it long enough. The victim was usually half naked by the time the crowd saw him, sweating, shaking, sometimes already bleeding from the beating that came before. And once the tar hit his skin, silence broke into screams. That was when the crowd leaned in, not back. Because that was the moment the punishment became a show. The feathers weren't just for humiliation, they were for spectacle. They stuck to every blister and open wound like the devil's glitter, transforming the victim into something both grotesque and comical, something the crowd could jeer at without confronting the fact that they were cheering a man's destruction. And then came the parade, the awful procession through town that turned cruelty into choreography. Every corner had a witness. Every window framed a moral lesson. Parents whispered warnings to their children, not to teach empathy, but to teach fear. This is what happens when you step out of line. This is what happens when you don't agree. And everyone pretended this was justice. But it wasn't about law. It was about order. The kind of order that depends on silence, compliance, and the unspoken agreement that if we hurt one man loud enough, we won't have to hurt ourselves. And if someone dared to look disgusted, dared to say it was too much, that person became suspect. Because in a town like that, neutrality was guilt and empathy was rebellion. So people smiled. They laughed. They talked about the punishment for weeks afterward like it was a tale from a play or a joke told over ale. Did you see the way he squealed? Feathers got in his mouth. He tried to stand up but his legs were shaking like jelly. They reenacted it with glee, like children mimicking something they didn't fully understand but knew they were supposed to enjoy. And Mark Zuckerberg? He'd be documenting every second. Capturing user data. Tracking eye movements. Calculating engagement scores for every flicker of pain. And when the tarred man was finally discarded, left twitching in a ditch, his skin blistered, his body an unrecognizable patchwork of pain and shame, Zuckerberg would already be pitching a new update, facial recognition for mobs, AI-generated feather animations, and a feature that let you virtually fling hot tar at a digital effigy of your enemies. And the terrifying thing? The town would thank him. They'd say it brought them closer. They'd say it made them feel safe. They'd say it was progress. But it wouldn't be. It would just be the same old violence, dressed up in new tools, clapped for by the same crowd that always loved watching someone else suffer, so long as it wasn't them. If Gwyneth Paltrow had been alive during Colonial America, she'd have had an entire Goop page dedicated to tar therapy, claiming it cleanses toxins, balances your mood, and restores your feminine essence. Never mind that the actual essence being restored smells like scorched flesh and regret. She'd be dipping a goose feather into a boiling pot and calling it an ancient purification ritual while someone in the background quietly screams because the tar just ate through their skin. Gwyneth would smile and whisper, "It's supposed to hurt, darling. That means it's working." But let's talk about what it actually did, because once the crowd left, once the torches dimmed and the cheers stopped echoing off the wooden walls of the butcher's shop and the empty chapel, the body was left to deal with what the mob didn't stick around for: survival. Boiling tar, real tar, not the imaginary kind in Gwyneth's spa fantasy, sticks deep. It doesn't just scald the skin, it bonds to it, bites into it, chews through layers until your nerves are exposed and screaming. When the tar was poured or brushed across someone's back, chest, or face, it didn't just burn, it branded. It clung like punishment made permanent. You could scrape it, but it took skin with it. You could wash it, but water made it worse. You could try fire, but what kind of fool adds more heat to a wound that's already hissing? So most people did nothing. Or worse, they tried the home remedies. A bit of vinegar, a scrap of linen, a river bath. And still, the tar stayed. Black and slick, hardened in cracks and curls like the devil's lacquer. It stank. It bled. It peeled. The feathers, glued to the pain, had to be ripped out one by one. Some came off with scabs. Others with skin. Sometimes with flesh. Infection set in fast. Not in days, in hours. This was an era before antibiotics, before proper antiseptic, before even the most basic medical sense reached small towns. A single splinter could kill a man. Now imagine an entire back covered in burns so deep they pulsed. Imagine trying to sleep while your skin crackles. Imagine trying to eat while your lips bleed from where the tar boiled them shut. People died. Not instantly. Not theatrically. They died quietly, days later, curled up in corners like dogs, feverish and muttering prayers that stuck in their swollen throats. They died from sepsis. From tetanus. From pain so sharp and endless that their own hearts gave up. But some survived. And for those, death might have been kinder. The survivors carried the punishment forever. Scars like rivers. Disfigurement. Numbness. Skin that never healed right. Some lost the use of their arms. Others lost half their hearing. One man went blind after tar was poured too close to his eyes. And there was no compensation. No apology. No medicine. Just silence. Just whispers. Just the lingering knowledge that if the crowd changed its mind again, if the wrong word slipped from your tongue, it could happen all over. And here's the cruelest twist, most of these men weren't criminals. They weren't murderers. They weren't even violent. They were customs officers. Shopkeepers. Neighbors. They were men who disagreed, or refused to pick a side, or stood still while the mob expected a cheer. One poor soul in New Hampshire was tarred and feathered for refusing to raise his mug in a revolutionary toast. That was it. No speech. No treason. Just hesitation. And for that, he bled for weeks and never walked properly again. Gwyneth would have bottled his pain, sold it in a chic little glass vial, and called it colonial grit. But there was nothing chic about it. Only blood. Pus. Skin that cracked open with each breath. Friends who stopped visiting. Children who stared in terror. A life reduced to shadows. So the next time someone romanticizes old-fashioned justice, or throws around the phrase, mob rule, like it's a funny little relic of history, remember the man trying to pull tar out of his ear with the edge of a stick. Remember the one who tried to burn it off and screamed so hard he passed out in the snow. Remember the ones who survived the mob only to rot slowly under the weight of their own body. There was no healing. No cleansing. No lesson. Only pain. Only silence. Only time. And even that wasn't enough. Because the tar never really left. They say history remembers the loudest victims, the ones who screamed through tar smoke and staggered through the square with black skin and a feathered chest, but it rarely pauses for the ones who were silenced before they ever made it to the square, women whose names dissolved before the pain did, whose stories were told in whispers behind locked shutters long after their bodies had stopped burning. Tar and feathering was never meant to spare anyone, and it didn't. If a woman stood out, stood tall, spoke too much, or even existed in the wrong place at the wrong hour with the wrong kind of defiance tucked beneath her ribcage, she became fair game. The crime didn't need to be treason or loyalty or sedition. For women, it could be gossip. An accusation of witchcraft. A refusal to marry. Or worse, sleeping with the enemy, real or rumored. They were dragged the same way, sometimes faster, sometimes rougher. There was no courtesy. No hesitance. Stripped of dignity, often stripped of everything else, their bodies were handled by men who pretended they were instruments of morality but acted like monsters behind the guise of justice. The tar didn't stop for modesty. It covered chests, thighs, the soft parts no hand should ever touch without consent. Feathers were thrown harder, almost gleefully, as if the laughter in the crowd wasn't just amusement but something darker, something hungry. And when the parade began, the jeers were sharper, more obscene. Women weren't just ridiculed, they were desecrated. Their reputations weren't bruised, they were annihilated. One woman in New York was accused of sleeping with British soldiers and was tarred and feathered in the dead of winter, then tied to a fence overnight with no covering, no food, no water. By morning, her skin had blistered open beneath the frozen pitch, and the frost had eaten into her toes. Another in North Carolina was dragged by her hair through the street before they poured the tar directly over her scalp, searing her scalp to the bone. She lived for 3 more years, in silence, her hair never growing back, her eyes never quite meeting another's again. For these women, survival wasn't just physical, it was social, spiritual, emotional. And most never survived all 3. Some ran. Some disappeared. Others stayed, faceless behind shawls, no longer spoken to except in hisses. Some took their lives quietly, rope or water or blade. And for everyone who did, there were 10 more who wanted to. The community's memory was long when it came to disgrace. They would forget your birthday, your child's name, your kindness, but they would never forget that night, that scream, that black stain on your body and your life. And when the feathers fell off, when the tar finally peeled away in scabs, when the skin tried to close itself back up around the pain, there was no rebirth. Only the echo of being made into a spectacle, not for anything you did, but for what you symbolized, too loud, too proud, too unafraid. Tar was never about justice. It was about correction. Correction of behavior. Of reputation. Of visibility. Women were expected to disappear into their homes, and if they didn't, the crowd made sure they would. Forever. And when the town gathered at church the next Sunday, they didn't sit beside her. They didn't speak her name. They prayed louder, clutched their daughters closer, and pretended it hadn't happened. Because shame is a powerful tool, but silence is stronger. And the tar, as always, lingered. Under her nails. Beneath her scalp. In the corners of every whispered room. It stayed. Because pain like that doesn't rinse off. It soaks in. And it remembers. Tar and feathering was never truly about crime. It was about control, and once you understand that, everything makes a different kind of sense, a darker kind, the kind that festers just beneath the skin like old wounds packed with salt. This wasn't about stopping lawbreakers or delivering justice. This was about reminding everyone who watched, who whispered, who dared to think for themselves, that the crowd had teeth, and they would bite without warning, without mercy, and without apology. It was domination served hot, poured in ladles onto bare skin, and wrapped in feathers to mock the pain with absurdity. Because if you can make someone suffer and look ridiculous doing it, you don't just hurt their body, you fracture their identity, their pride, their sense of being safe in their own skin. You turn them into a thing to point at, a story to pass on, a warning that doesn't need to be written down. And the people who did it, the ones who held the ropes and stirred the tar and ripped the feathers from the sacks. They didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as guardians of order, as enforcers of tradition, as righteous voices acting on behalf of something larger, something holy. That's what made it worse. Because when someone hurts you and knows they're wrong, you have something to fight against, some weight to push back on. But when they believe they're right, when they believe they're saving the community, defending the future, protecting their children, then there is no reasoning with them. There is only heat and rope and smoke and screams that echo longer than the act itself. The victims weren't always loud. Some were quiet. Some were men who never raised their voice once in their lives. Some were women who lived alone and did nothing more than stay that way. Some were enslaved, punished not because they had stepped out of line, but because someone decided to remind them they had a line. And the cruelty didn't end when the feathers settled. That was only the beginning. The real punishment happened afterward, when the body tried to heal and the soul found it couldn't. Because how do you heal from being dehumanized in public? How do you go back to buying bread from a man who laughed as the tar soaked into your chest? How do you kneel in church next to someone who helped carry the barrel? You don't. You live on the outside. Even if you're allowed to stay, even if you rebuild your home or reopen your shop or pass people on the street who look down and pretend they didn't watch, you're never truly back. You are branded, not with ink or iron, but with memory. With a pain that keeps returning in flashes, in the sound of boiling water, in the way children flinch when you walk past. And it was meant to be that way. That's the point. Domination doesn't end when the act ends. It's built to echo, to ripple, to stain everything that comes after. Because domination isn't just about silencing one person. It's about teaching everyone else how far they'll fall if they make the same mistake. It's a performance with 1 star and 1,000 lessons. And what kind of mistake warranted this kind of horror? Loyalty to the wrong flag. Speaking up in the wrong tone. Not speaking up fast enough. A glance. A refusal. An idea. That's all it took. And in that way, tar and feathering was a form of mass education. It taught children that justice looked like fire. It taught women that safety was an illusion. It taught the poor that their pain didn't matter. And it taught everyone else that silence was the only way to survive. You don't need chains to trap people if you give them enough fear. Fear does the job better than any prison. It keeps people small. It keeps heads down. It rewrites the story before it's ever told. And in the end, that's what domination wants, not just your obedience, but your transformation. It wants you to see yourself as less. To believe it was your fault. To carry the shame like it's yours to hold. And so you do. You walk slower. You speak softer. You forget how to look people in the eye. And the crowd, the town, the system, they don't need to tar you twice. Once was enough. Because now you carry the tar inside you. Time does strange things to pain, it rewrites it, repaints it, repositions it until what was once horror becomes heritage, and that's exactly what happened with tar and feathering. Because not long after the screams faded and the skin healed in crooked patches, the storytellers moved in, and they didn't come to tell the truth. They came to tidy it up. They came with brushes and canvas and bold lines, and they painted the mobs as heroes and the victims as footnotes, if they mentioned them at all. The sketches in textbooks, the woodcuts passed around as patriot propaganda, showed proud rebels hoisting barrels with purpose, not with malice. The crowd wasn't a pack of grinning hyenas. They were noble farmers, strong-chinned blacksmiths, men of character and cause, standing up against tyranny with tar in their hands and justice on their lips. The victims were drawn as vague, generic men, no faces, no burns, no feathers melted into their wounds. Just a little black smear here, a couple of downy tufts there, a scowl if the artist was feeling generous. But no horror. No agony. No stench. No rot. No sound. That was all conveniently erased. Because to make something shameful into something sacred, you don't have to lie, you just have to leave things out. And so they did. They turned punishment into pride. They told children it was a clever form of protest, a prank almost, a page in the story of how the colonies found their backbone. They forgot to mention the third-degree burns. The nerve damage. The women humiliated so thoroughly they never spoke in public again. They didn't talk about the man who couldn't sleep on his back for the rest of his life. They didn't mention the slaves who were punished with tar for trying to run or speak or breathe without permission. No, they talked about the revolution, about the rising spirit of America, about liberty and justice and symbolic gestures. Because tar and feathering, they said, wasn't violence, it was a message. And in a way, they were right. It was a message. But the message wasn't about freedom. It was about fear. It was about reminding everyone who held the power and what they would do to keep it. And when that power changed hands, when the rebels became the rulers, they didn't apologize. They just rewrote the script. They told stories around fires and in schoolhouses and inside sermons about brave townspeople taking justice into their own hands, and they spoke with the kind of warm nostalgia that curdles in your stomach if you know the real version. But most people didn't. Most people grew up hearing that tar and feathering was just part of the past, a colorful detail, something boys used to joke about when reenacting the revolution in fields with fake drums and powdered wigs from the general store. It became theatrical. And in becoming theater, it was defanged. That's what forgetting does. That's what romanticizing does. It steals the blood from the street and replaces it with flag-colored ribbons. And the ghosts? The real victims? They don't get angry. They just go quiet. Because even in death, they understand that the crowd always wins. The crowd decides who gets remembered. The crowd decides what was necessary, what was deserved, what was noble. And the crowd doesn't want to remember screaming. It wants symbols. It wants statues. It wants songs. So tar and feathering joined the chorus of things we pretend were never as bad as they were, tucked neatly beside terms like frontier justice and old-fashioned values, wrapped in parchment and tied with string like a gift from history. But the truth is still there. If you dig through the right letters, the right diaries, the right confessions scrawled in cramped ink by men who never forgot what they did, you'll find it. The pain didn't go away. It just stopped being spoken. And now, hundreds of years later, people still joke about it, still nod when it's mentioned in old films or tossed around as a metaphor for political consequences, but they never smell the tar or see the skin slide off or feel the shame soak into the bones of someone who was made into a lesson. And maybe that's the final punishment, not just being burned, but being forgotten. Not just being humiliated, but being turned into a myth so clean, so scrubbed, so glorified, that even your suffering becomes propaganda. And the feathers? They're still floating somewhere. Stuck in the margins of old stories, clinging to the edge of memory. Waiting. You'd like to think it ended, wouldn't you, that the last feather fell somewhere in the 1800s and was swept away with the dirt and the blood and the silence, that people learned something, changed somehow, became gentler or wiser or at least more ashamed. But they didn't, not really, they just changed tools, changed locations, changed the way they watched, because the crowd never leaves, it only adapts, and if they no longer gather in the square with fists full of feathers, they gather in comments, in hashtags, in inboxes, in screens glowing like torches in the dark, and the screaming hasn't stopped, it's just gotten quieter, more efficient, more constant. And now they don't even need a bucket of tar, just a phone and an opinion and a little momentum, and they can break someone the same way the mob once did, strip them down, cover them in shame, parade them until they crack, and pretend it was necessary, pretend it was justice, because the line never changes, just the method. Public punishment is older than laws. It lives in the human spine, that twitch in the back of the brain that says if I can't fix the world, I can at least destroy this one person who said something wrong, or the wrong thing, made me uncomfortable, and the digital square is bigger than any town ever was, and the tar is cold now, but the shame burns hotter than it ever did. And the worst part is how easy it is, how fast it happens. One accusation. One mistake. One clipped video or misread phrase or misjudged silence, and suddenly there's a mob with no faces and no names, just fury and endless scrolling, and the person at the center, maybe guilty, maybe not, has no rope to climb, no woods to run to, no cart to fall off of, just notifications and panic and the sinking realization that once the feathers stick, there's no washing them off. They cling. Not to skin now, but to search results, to resumes, to whispers in rooms where the door is already shut. And everyone watching says the same thing. Well, they must have done something, because the crowd needs the illusion of guilt to justify the spectacle, needs to believe that justice is being served, not consumed, not enjoyed, and so they tell themselves it's accountability, it's consequence, it's community policing, but all it is another parade, another loop of pain with a fresh victim and a recycled chant. And the modern version doesn't even end, doesn't fade into memory the way the old punishments did, because the internet doesn't forget, and so the tar stays fresh, clickable, searchable, replayable, forever. And the people who join in, who click, who share, who throw their digital feathers into the ring, most of them don't think they're part of anything brutal. They think they're helping. They think they're standing up. But what they're really doing is participating in an ancient ritual with a new interface, a ceremony of collapse, and when they close the app and go to bed, the victim is still bleeding, still trying to breathe through a coat of public outrage so thick they can't find themselves anymore. And when you ask the crowd later, when it's all calmed down, when the next target has arrived, they'll say the same things they always said: it wasn't that bad, or they deserved it, or I was just watching. And history repeats itself, not because we forget but because we lie, and the biggest lie is that we wouldn't do it again, that we're better now, more civilized, more conscious, but we're not, because every generation finds its tar, and every crowd learns how to throw, and what changes isn't our cruelty but our comfort with it. And if you're lucky, if you never step out of line, maybe you'll only ever be in the crowd, not the cart, not the ditch, not the one peeling shame off your skin, one comment at a time. But don't mistake safety for innocence. The mob doesn't care who you are. It cares only that you're next. And when the heat comes for you, when your name flickers in the torchlight, when the air tastes like judgment and feathers fill your lungs, don't look for mercy. There won't be any. There never was. You don't get mobs without permission, not really, because behind every boiling bucket and every bloody parade there's always a voice in the back of the room saying, it's justified, and that voice sounds reasonable, sounds official, sounds like it cares about order, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Because cruelty doesn't always enter the room screaming, sometimes it walks in quietly with a law book in one hand and a Bible in the other and says, we had no choice, and people believe it, they always do, because they want to believe that violence can be noble if it's neat enough, if it's wrapped in rules, if it's carried out in the name of stability or morality or God, and so they write it down, in town records, in ledgers, in sermons, and they call it necessary, call it rare, call it regretful but righteous, and what they're really doing is giving the mob a script, teaching the townspeople how to sleep at night with blood on their boots and screams still ringing in their ears. Tar and feathering didn't happen in a vacuum, it was encouraged, tolerated, blessed. If not officially, then culturally, quietly, passively, in the way the mayor looked away or the priest shook his head just enough to imply disapproval without ever stepping between the victim and the crowd. Because if you stand in the way, you become the next target, and no one wanted to be the next body in the square, so they let it happen, and the community learned quickly that silence was safer than compassion. And when the punishment was over, when the man or woman or child was dumped in the cold, shaking, blind with humiliation and half-cooked pain, the town held its breath for a moment, and then exhaled, not with guilt but with relief. Because the threat had passed. The fear had been transferred. The order had been preserved. And to ensure it stayed that way, they invented reasons. Dozens of them. Pages. Volumes. They said the victim was a traitor. A whore. A heretic. A spy. A liar. A disruptor. A blasphemer. A coward. A thief. A threat. They didn't even need proof. All they needed was the story to sound plausible enough to justify the tar. And once it was written, once it was told, it hardened like pitch around the truth, ugly and final. And the victim could never undo it. Could never speak enough, prove enough, cry enough, beg enough to make the town see who they really were. Because once you're coded in someone else's version of events, you're no longer a person. You're a symbol. A smudge on the map. A feathered warning nailed to memory. And no one feels sorry for a warning. That's the part the crowd clings to most, the idea that they were preserving peace. That their violence kept things stable. That they were acting on behalf of some invisible higher order, one that justified the pain and erased the humanity of whoever happened to fall beneath the mob's boots. And today, we do the same thing. We tell ourselves that public shaming is accountability. That collective outrage is justice. That destroying someone's name, their job, their life, their sanity, is all part of balancing some ancient scale. But we don't do it because we care about balance. We do it because we want control. And because we still believe the lie that hurting one person can restore peace to many. That there's such a thing as clean violence, as holy punishment, as righteous humiliation. There isn't. There never was. And yet entire systems were built around that belief. Colonies. Churches. Governments. Families. Everyone needed a scapegoat, a pressure valve, a burning body to light the road forward. So they sanctioned the scream, institutionalized the pitch, codified the parade, and still called themselves civilized. And when they gathered years later to write the stories, they used soft words. They said the man was handled. The woman was corrected. The child was disciplined. They avoided the word burned. They skipped over broken. They omitted raped. They removed tortured. Because those words had weight. Those words didn't fit the version of themselves they wanted history to remember. And so the story got smaller. Cleaner. Safer. Until it fit inside a classroom, or a film reel, or a museum plaque that said nothing of the agony, only that this was how they handled dissent in those days. And when the children read it, they nodded, not realizing that the real lesson wasn't in what was said, but in what was erased. Because violence is always easiest to repeat when you don't call it by its name. Even now, centuries later, if you close your eyes and listen long enough, you can almost hear it, the hiss of hot tar meeting flesh, the dry crackle of feathers sticking where skin split open, the shuffle of feet not running away but lining up to watch, to gawk, to laugh, to agree with their silence that this is what justice looks like, that this is what must be done, that this is what order demands. And it's still happening, not with barrels and torches but with words and screens and teeth bared behind keyboards and the same old hunger in different clothes, because people don't stop loving punishment, they just change how they apply it, how they share it, how they defend it. And the ones who go through it today might not be tied to carts or marched through the town square, but they're just as exposed, just as burned, just as feathered, except now the feathers are rumors, headlines, screenshots, retweets, stitched videos and weaponized silence, and the tar is shame, thick and permanent and impossible to scrape off no matter how many apologies you pour over it. The crowd still watches, still waits for the moment someone flinches, because that's when it feels real, that's when it feels earned, and then they move on like nothing happened, like nothing was lost, like there wasn't a person under all that smoke. But the person remembers. Always. The one who lived through it, who bore the fire and the laughter and the echo that never dims, they carry it. Not in scars the world can see but in the tremble of trust, in the reflexive doubt, in the way they shrink when something feels too loud, too close, too familiar. They remember how easy it was for everyone else. How fast the hands turned. How quickly kindness vanished. They remember the faces that looked away. The ones who came closer. The ones who said nothing at all. And there's no returning from that. Not really. You can go home, if it wasn't burned. You can heal, if the wounds were shallow. You can rebuild, if anyone still speaks your name. But something stays broken, not just in you, but in the world. In the space where you used to feel safe. And no amount of years can fill that. The stories told after are quiet. Tired. Sometimes whispered to children, not as bedtime tales, but as warnings wrapped in breath. And sometimes they're not told at all, because no one wants to say out loud what they let happen, what they helped happen. But you can feel it. In places with history layered under paint, in roads where blood once pooled and feathers once drifted, in walls that listened but never spoke. The tar might be gone, the barrel long rusted, the square now paved and filled with benches and birds, but the air still knows. The ground remembers. Because memory doesn't fade. It thickens. It settles into the bones of places and people and families, passed down not in words, but in fears that don't make sense until one day they do. That's the true legacy of it all, not the act itself, but the after. The silence it created. The trust it killed. The comfort it replaced with vigilance. And even if the method is gone, the instinct remains. To burn what we don't understand. To humiliate what we can't control. To parade the broken as proof that rules are being followed. To hurt, just enough to be remembered. That's what the tar was always for. Not to stop crime. But to make sure no one forgot who was in charge. So now we call it different names. We say it's for order. For consequences. For truth. But the scream sounds the same. The crowd still cheers. And the tar still sticks. What they never talk about, what the history books skip and the museums gloss over, is what happened to the ones who lived with the punished, the wives who had to peel tar from their husbands' backs with rags and boiled water and tears that never made a sound, the children who learned too young that their father wasn't a man anymore but a warning, that their home wasn't safe anymore but marked, that when they walked to the market, people whispered not just about what happened but what it meant, what it said. And what it said was don't trust them, don't sit near them, don't marry into them, because the stain doesn't end with the body, it spreads, it settles, it burrows into a name like rust on a blade, and once your family is touched by that kind of shame, you carry it like a second skin. People cross the street. Business dries up. Invitations disappear. Friends vanish into polite avoidance, as if pain is contagious, as if humiliation might drip off your clothes and stain theirs. And so the family learns to grow smaller, quieter, more careful. They walk with their heads down. They answer questions with soft voices. They never contradict, never provoke, never dare. Because they know. One spark, and it happens again. One suspicion, one wrong joke, one overheard sentence in the wrong tavern, and the bucket returns. Maybe not of tar this time. Maybe now it's a rumor. A letter. A meeting behind closed doors. But it hurts just the same. And the children grow up with that in their bones. They don't name it. They don't know where it started. But they inherit the fear like an heirloom. They flinch when voices rise. They scan rooms for exits. They distrust joy because joy doesn't last, it flickers, and then the fire comes. And they pass that on. Without meaning to. Without knowing. They pass it through quiet parenting, through cautious advice, through bedtime stories that are always a little darker than they should be. They pass it through nervous glances and the way their hands shake during arguments and the way they teach their children to always, always, blend in. And so it continues. The tar might be gone. The feathers long swept. But the memory keeps living in the choices people make, the things they never say, the trust they never give, the walls they never take down. And in towns where this happened, where men were burned alive with community approval, there's a stillness that never fully lifts. People walk past the old square and don't know why they feel cold. People light candles without knowing what for. Old women refuse to talk about their grandfathers. Old men change the subject when asked what their great-aunt did during the war, during the uprising, during the unrest. And no one asks twice. Because everyone has decided, consciously or not, that the best way to keep the peace is to leave the tar buried. But tar doesn't stay buried. Not really. It soaks into the ground. It poisons the roots. It makes everything around it grow twisted. So the towns with that history, those sleepy streets with names you'll never hear in a documentary, they're haunted. Not with ghosts. With patterns. With pain that repeats. With families that fall apart for reasons no one can explain. With children who never feel safe even when they should. With a collective memory so thick and old and unspoken that it might as well be blood on the bricks. You can't fix that with a plaque. You can't apologize it away. You can only name it. And naming it hurts. Naming it means looking at your grandfather and asking, were you there? Did you help hold him down? Did you throw the first feather? Naming it means asking yourself, if it happened again, would I speak up? Would I stop it? Or would I do what they did, laugh, stay silent, or worse, help? That's the true legacy of tar and feathering. Not the pain. Not the spectacle. But the silence that came after. The silence that calcified into fear and passed itself on, generation to generation, like a cursed heirloom no one ever puts down. There are places now, quiet places, neat towns with well-painted porches and trimmed hedges and picket fences so clean they sparkle in the morning sun, where the air feels calm and the people smile and the streets are named after founders and fathers and revolutions and prayers, and if you didn't know better, you'd think nothing bad ever happened there, but it did, and the ground remembers, even if the people don't, or won't, because some places carry their shame like a secret pact, pressed under layers of charm and hospitality and unspoken rules, the kind you only learn by living there long enough to feel them tightening around your ribs when you ask the wrong question or bring up the wrong name or look too long at the wrong statue. Because beneath the whitewash, beneath the curated tours and the history museums and the reenactments with costumed actors and musket salutes, there is still tar in the cracks, tar in the soil, tar in the way people talk about outsiders, in the way they say, "We don't discuss that," in the way they remember who was punished and forget why, and the houses that line the old squares still stand, their walls once glowing orange from the fires of crowds who called themselves neighbors but behaved like wolves, and the wood still creaks from the weight of history pressed into its grain, the front steps still hold the memory of men tied to posts, of women dragged down them screaming, of feathers scattered by the wind and carried through alleys like cursed snow, and the basements hold trunks filled with the wrong kind of heirlooms, with clippings and tools and clothes that were never supposed to survive but did, and someone's grandmother still keeps them in silence, pretending she doesn't know what they were for, and when the children ask why she doesn't go near the square anymore, she says she's tired, or that the sun hurts her eyes, or that there's nothing left there to see, but there is, because these places never really move on, they just rearrange the guilt, hide it under traditions and polite nods and county fair banners, and in some of these towns the old laws are still on the books, the ones that allowed vigilante committees and public enforcement of moral behavior, the ones that never used the word tar, but didn't need to, and no one's bothered to remove them, because no one wants to admit they were real in the first place. These places produce generations of people who speak softly and vote quietly and don't ask for much, because they were taught from birth that safety comes from invisibility, from compliance, from never making the kind of noise that draws attention, and if they do act out, if they do rebel, they do it far from home, in cities where no one knows their grandfather's name or what he did on a Tuesday night in 1775 when the crowd lit the fire and someone needed to carry the feathers. And even the land feels different, there's something in the trees, in the stillness of the woods behind the churchyard, something that hums when the air gets too still, something that makes animals stop walking when they reach certain clearings, something that makes visitors pause and feel cold even in the heat of summer, because memory doesn't live in words alone. It lives in place, in silence, in the air you breathe and the water that runs under the street, and these towns breathe through lungs built on humiliation and fear. And still, the people pretend. They host festivals. They wave flags. They tell themselves they are proud descendants of rebels, of brave men who stood for something. But no one stands in the exact spot where the barrel used to boil. No one celebrates there. They plant flowers over it and call it sacred ground. They clean the statue but not the story. And when someone from outside the town tries to ask too much, tries to dig, it never ends well. Doors close. Stories shift. Eyes go cold. Because truth is dangerous in places built on forgetting. It threatens the peace. It threatens the inheritance. It threatens the illusion that this was ever just, ever noble, ever anything more than a weapon disguised as righteousness. So they hold their silence. Not just out of shame, but out of habit. Out of fear. Out of the knowledge that even now, even in modern times, even with new laws and new norms and new technology, the crowd hasn't gone. It's just waiting for something to burn. Something to punish. And they all know, somewhere deep in their bones, that when that moment comes, when the whispers rise and the heat returns, no flower bed or plaque will stop it. The tar is gone. But the hands that held the ropes are not. Tar and feathering was never just about punishment. It was control dressed up as justice, cruelty made into a ritual, a lesson written in fire across the skin of anyone who dared to stand apart. It wasn't reserved for the wicked, it was used on the inconvenient, the disobedient, the loud, the different. And what made it brutal wasn't just the burning tar or the public ridicule, it was the way the crowd participated and then walked away as if nothing happened. That's the part that stuck. The part that still sticks. Because while the buckets may be gone and the feathers no longer fly, the instinct remains. We've seen it. Felt it. Online. At work. In whispers. In the way people dogpile. In the way the world punishes before it listens. In the way we turn suffering into content. The tar today is digital, the feathers are public shame, and the crowd is always watching. And yet, behind all the screaming, the silence still does the most damage. The way towns buried their stories. The way families passed down fear. The way victims never got to be more than footnotes, if they were remembered at all. But now you've heard their stories. You've walked the square. You've smelled the smoke. And maybe, just maybe, you'll carry those echoes a little differently. Maybe next time the crowd starts gathering, physically or virtually, you'll remember what it costs to be in the center of the circle. And you'll step back. Or better, you'll speak. Because history doesn't stop. It waits. And it repeats when no one's looking. If this story stayed with you, if it whispered something you didn't expect, then let it settle deeper. And if you want more forgotten truths, more brutal histories told without gloss, without mercy, and without skipping the worst parts, subscribe. There are more stories like this. So many more. Sleep well, if you can. The past is never really past. It just changes its mask. And it always waits for silence.